Hello and welcome. Thank you for clicking on the video today. My name is Zachary Keith with Fitness Simplified, and this video is going to be about whether or not you can round your back while lifting. And I know I've received a number of messages about putting some stuff up on the walls behind me. Didn't have time to get to it for this video, but I promise you something is in the works to hopefully make this box that I subsist in a little less dull. So apologize for that not being the case already, but hopefully by the time another video comes out, that should be the case. So back to the topic at hand, rounding your back while lifting. Now, maintaining a straight back or a neutral spine has been lifting advice that's been provided for as long as most people can remember. Despite how common this advice is, the underlying arguments upon which it is built aren't all as strong as you might think. And in recent years, stronger lines of evidence have come out suggesting that this claim might not be as justifiable as once thought. So in the remainder of this video, I intend to explain to you what I mean by that and what you really need to know about back mechanics and back safety while lifting, like whether it's a box off the ground or doing a deadlift. So let's start off by discussing why a rounded back was ever really considered dangerous in the first place. So as a brief, super quick point of anatomy, your spine alternates between vertebra, the bony part, and discs in between each one. The discs serve as a sort of shock absorber, among other things, and they have a nucleus inside of them. What happens in the case of a disc herniation is that this nucleus translates out of the center of the disc, and if this happens, it may come in contact with a nerve, which may lead to pain. The common mechanistic thinking is that the more the back rounds, or the more it bends forward or bends backwards, the more pressure is put on one side and the more likely the nucleus is to be pushed to the other side. At least this is what has been shown in cadaveric studies, i.e. dead people, where they take the spine of a cadaver, a dead person, and they flex it, extend it, they bend it forward and back, and they kind of see what happens to the integrity of the spine. In fact, this has only been shown in cadaver studies, which we'll talk more about that in a sec. But the problem with that argument in general is that you aren't dead, presumably, if you're watching this. And how things play out in living organisms can be very different than how things play out in a dead person. The most obvious difference is that a dead body has no ability to adapt. Everything that happens to it is pure breakdown, decay, wear and tear, etc. And this is not the case for a living body. A better and more applicable line of evidence would be research looking at living people. So let's look at what that has to say, which, by the way, as always, there's about 8 references I'm using to support this article and video combination. So I'm going to link the accompanying article in the description box below this video. All of these citations will be next to the claims that they seek to support. So if you want to look further into any of this or fact check anything I'm saying, hopefully that helps you line up which reference I'm using to support which claim. Again, that'll be down in the description box below. So that said, let's start talking about research in living people. So in 2020, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis, which again is a fancy word for study of studies, from Sarah Kenny and others. And what they did is that they compiled all of the research in living humans, looking at lumbar joint angles, so lower back joint angles, like the angles, the amount of bending at each vertebra, disc, vertebra interval, and that in relation to lower back pain. And an interesting thing that they found is that subjects with lower back pain tended to lift with an average of 6 degrees less lumbar flexion than those without pain. So in other words, these subjects that had pain tended to lift with a more neutral spine than those who did not have pain. Now, the authors do note that the people who had pain in the systematic review could have been told to maintain a neutral spine after the onset of pain, which kind of confounds the credibility of that claim. But nevertheless, it is an interesting point of contrast there. Overall, when you look at all the data they compiled in relation to the angles at someone's lower back, how bent or rounded or neutral it was, and that in relation to lower back pain, there was no association. 2 years later, in 2022, the authors of that same systematic review conducted another laboratory study with better methodological control. That one's a tongue twister. And found similar results as was found in this previous systematic review. So the bottom line is that there is no evidence in living humans that a rounded back contributes to lower back pain. Granted, it is difficult to design a good study on a subject like this because it's not very ethical, or at least it wouldn't pass many ethical boards to say, hey, we're gonna design the study and see who gets hurt first. That's not generally going to pass as a study that's allowed to happen. But nevertheless, everything that is available suggests that there is no relationship. That said, everyone knows that lower back pain can come from lifting in some way, shape, or form. Everyone has probably experienced, a thrown out back after lifting something quote unquote weird. So really the question is, if it's not a rounded back that is doing that, what is it? Well, there's really two other variables that seem to be at play, as it seems to me. The first is forward leaning. And now this refers to bending at the hips, not the spine, and bending forward without your hips translating backward. Now, I want to make a note that this movement is different than rounding at the lower back, because in a bend like that, at the hips, where you lean forward without your hips going back, generally in that sort of structure, your spine is neutral for all intents and purposes. The result of this is that a little extra torque is experienced at the lumbar spine due to the distance between the center of mass of your back and the fulcrum, which is your hips. Now, this is a common reason why, oftentimes you'll see people say, keep the weight close to your body, or if you're doing a deadlift, you want to keep the bar close to your shins and kick your hips back and not let your body lean forward, because then your legs have a bit more leverage and they can contribute, and not so much of the load is needed to be placed on the lower back. Now, a caveat to note that I want to make clear here is that it's not like this position is inherently dangerous. All it does is it makes any weight feel heavier to your lower back, at least. To illustrate what I mean by that, imagine you were holding the bottom of a broom and you're holding it upright with your arm just kind of straight up ahead of you. And you started to let the broom lean forward. All right, so the broom is more horizontal to the floor rather than upright. What you would expect is that the broom would therefore feel heavier on your wrist, on your shoulder, etc., because the center of gravity of the broom is farther away from your wrist. And that is just what's happening at your lower back in the case of forward trunk inclination, so bending forward without your hips going back. It's just that lever arm is a bit longer, which makes the force feel heavier. So if you're holding a weight that your body can handle in this position, then there's no real threat of injury. The problem, again, is that any weight feels heavier to your lower back in this position. So, some weight that in other positions might feel comfortable to your body might be too much in that position. The second factor about, lifting and lower back pain that is probably more important and pertinent is just simple load and volume management. So in other words, being mindful of how much weight your back is responsible for taking care of, and how many times it has to take care of that. And if you've digested any of my other content, then you've probably seen me say that concept about other parts of the body, because it is true about every part of the body. So think of it this way. At any point in time, there is some dose of exercise or movement that will, one, not be sufficient to produce any adaptation, two, be sufficient to produce a fitness adaptation, i.e. more strength, more, connective tissue structure, etc. Or three, be too much, more than your body can handle, and increase risk of injury. The idea behind load and volume management, and most training programs at large, is to accurately put yourself in that middle category, the one that is not too little, not too much, but is going to produce a fitness adaptation. Now, this may seem simple and obvious, but it's really where most people tend to go wrong when it comes to movement safety. It's either one, they're not spending enough time in that middle category, so they're not adequately prepared for when life throws something at them, or two, they're not mindful to when they might be put in a position where they are placed in that third category. So in other words, they do too much, too soon, or too often. Now, there's a great deal of nuance that can go into figuring out, just what does it mean for you to be in that middle category, the one that is not too little, not too much, but it will produce an adaptation. Explaining that isn't necessarily the point of this video, but hopefully that illustrates the idea that, just letting yourself get into that third category, the one that where it's too much, tends to be where most people go wrong with this sort of thing. Another thing to point out is that being mindful of forward leaning, as was explained in that first point, is another variable to load and volume management. So again, if your hips do not move back and your body leans forward, the load felt by your back increases, and therefore, it's an aspect of load that needs to be managed. So let me wrap up this video by giving you the bottom line here. So based on how things stand in the research, rounding your back a little bit while lifting a load does not seem to be an independent risk factor for lower back pain. That said, that doesn't mean there's no merit to aiming for a neutral spine when lifting. Most people, in my experience, tend to be stronger and feel more efficient in this position. And at the end of the day, that's really just what exercise technique is all about. Another reason to aim for a neutral spine is if it might help you target a muscle more effectively. Now, having a neutral spine won't always help you do this, and sometimes even having a bit of a rounding in your spine will help you target some muscles more effectively. But nevertheless, that is another criteria you might think about when you're deciding, what sort of posture or position or technique you want to employ on an exercise. However, to say that maintaining a neutral spine is independently safer is not an evidence-based statement. So that is it for this video. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you found that helpful or interesting or somewhere between, and I will see you next time.